I mean, when we talk about Bitcoin standard, I think a family, an individual, or a company can adopt the Bitcoin standard. I don't think we're anywhere close to a nation state adopting a Bitcoin standard. And what it really refers to normally is people focus upon accumulating and storing their wealth in sound money, and they view the Bitcoin as the soundest money. With regard to inflation, I mean, there's three theoretical sources of inflation. One is acts of God. If there's an earthquake and you live on an island, or a tsunami and you live on an island and ships can't get to you and there's a shortage of food or fuel, you're going to have inflation on the island. It has nothing to do with monetary policy. It has nothing to do with political or fiscal policy. It has nothing to do with any policy. You just got struck by an earthquake. The second source is monetary policy. If there's 10 houses in the city and the supply of currency increases by a factor of 10, all other things being equal, the price of the houses is going up, probably by a factor of 10. The third source of inflation is public policy. If the federal government legislates a 10-hour work week, common sense says that stuff is going to get more expensive than a 40-hour work week or an 80-hour work week. And if they put a tariff or they make it illegal to import cheap products from China or to fabricate semiconductors in Taiwan, the price of those things is going up. So I think if we're reasonable and intellectually honest, we'll say that all sorts of policy interventions, be they monetary or defense policy, right? Foreign policy, wage and price controls, labor policy, all these policies can create inflation. And my general view, and I think most Bitcoiners' general view, is we want less government, and we believe that most public policy intervention is inflationary. And inflation itself, caused by political process, generally is not good for the world. And if the politicians weren't passing a law making it illegal to manufacture something somewhere, then someone would have manufactured it and they'd be selling it to you cheaper. And so the market economy is functioning in order to drive the price of everything down whenever it can, and the public policy is driving it up. If you would like to tell, by the way, George, I'll agree with you. Nobody should buy Bitcoin with their credit card. I have yet to meet anybody that says they bought Bitcoin with a credit card. I'm not a fan of credit card debt, and I've never recommended people go into debt to buy Bitcoin. I've said the inverse, which is if you had a 30-year mortgage and it was at 2.5% interest, and you're deciding whether you should pay off your mortgage for the rest of your life or whether you should carry the mortgage forward, I think that when you're in a financial, an environment of financial repression, that is the definition being if the inflation rate's 10% and the mortgage rate is 3%, in that repression environment, you're better off to carry debt. In an environment where it was the inverse, if the inflation rate was 3% and the interest rate was 10%, then of course you'd be better off to carry equity. And so the other point I'd make, George, though, is you talk about the government, but in fact there's 180 different governments. So you could say, well, I think that the United States didn't create as much money as whatever. Well, what about Venezuela, and what about Argentina, and what about Brazil, and what about everywhere? Everybody in the world, all 8 billion people, is struggling with money supply or currency supplies that are being manipulated by every government. They're also struggling. The other source of inflation and money supply expansion, or currency supply expansion to be precise, is fractional banking, right? So the banks can create additional currency units, the governments can create additional currency units, and the victims are always the people, and the beneficiaries are always the banks and the political systems.
Right. But there, Mike, we go back to that idea that there's a one-to-one relationship where if you increase M2 money supply by 1 unit, you're going to get an additional 1 unit of consumer price inflation. And when you look at that chart, the one that we went over earlier, I won't go over it again, you see that there isn't really a good relationship.
George, you're showing a manipulated metric. You're showing CPI, and I just showed you that the inflation rate is double on gold and it's double again on land.
Yeah, but no, this is back in the 1800s, Michael. We saw a 400% increase in M2, and we saw prices go down by 50%.
Well, if we study monetary history, we know we had hyperinflation in the Revolutionary War. We know we had hyperinflation in the Civil War. Right, so we've had many bouts of hyperinflation, and they all came along with printing, wheelbarrows and wagons full of paper currency.
Well, but that's where the government is creating the currency, and in this case, it would have been the banking system creating those additional currency units to lend to entrepreneurs to create more goods and services. That's a big difference there, and then it goes back to what you were saying earlier about this inflation. The root cause of this inflation isn't necessarily the creation of additional currency units. That's the point I want to make, especially if those currency units are going up with pretty much the rate of real GDP. The problem is when the currency units being created, whether it's by the government or the banking system, go up in excess to real GDP as a result of the government being a bigger part of the overall pie, which creates less productivity, which makes real GDP go down.
Okay, so, based on my lifetime in business and the last few hundred years of economic history I have a vague awareness with, it seems like the real GDP, or the total supply of goods and services or capital equipment in the economy, grows about 2 or 3% a year. Like when the economy's working and everything's working normally, you get about 2 or 3% more a year. And under a gold standard, when the gold supply was growing at 2 or 3% a year, you could probably have stable prices because the currency supply is incrementing at the rate of additional goods and